I know I've no right to sit at the table that you set before your children. I'm not after that. I just want the crumbs. Just give me one crumb, Jesus. Heal my little girl. I know she's not part of your family. I know we're not one of your children. I'm not asking you give me the food that is meant for the children. I'm just asking for one crumb. She calls Jesus Lord. She certainly knew who Jesus was and wasn't just asking for one crumb. Won't you heal my little girl? What great faith that woman showed. She praised her for her answer. Jesus praised her for her answer. And I don't believe it was just the reply that he was praising. I think he was praising her dogged determination. She wasn't going to give up. She kept on coming back and asking and pleading Jesus. And she showed great faith because she believed that Jesus could do what he said. So Jesus tells us, because of her reply, she could go home. The demon had left her daughter. She didn't say, stay there pleading with Jesus. Oh, come with me. She accepted what he said by faith. Just like the centurion said, you don't need to say anything. You just need to say the word and they'll be healed. You don't need to come with me and lay hands on it. You just need to speak the word and it'll happen. And she believed his word. When he said he was going to do it, she believed in her faith. What great faith. And you can imagine when she got home, and who did she find there but her daughter, sitting in her right mind. Oh, can you imagine the joy that must have been in her heart when she saw that? Oh, the excitement that would have been there. Her daughter who'd been bound by these demons of doing all sorts of things to her. And yet she was free. And that same Jesus who set this young girl free is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He still sets people free today. He still breaks the bounds that bind people. He still breaks the chains. And this is where we're going to pick up the story again in verse 31. Because it tells us then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. Jesus probably didn't stay very long in Tyre after he'd healed this woman's daughter. For it tells us he left the vicinity of Tyre and he went through Sidon, heading down to the Sea of Galilee, heading into the Decapolis. Now, you might not think that this verse is very controversial, but actually it is. Because this particular verse has puzzled scholars for centuries. And the reason for that is, some have suggested, that Jesus going up to Sidon, it shouldn't be there. Because why would you go up to Sidon only to come back down again? I mean, let me try and give you a scenario that would perhaps equate it. Supposing you were going from here to Birmingham, and you take a detour. The detour of going to Sidon, going down to the Decapolis, would be like going up to Newcastle and then coming back to Birmingham. So you're going to Birmingham, but instead of going straight down, you go straight up and then come back down. You see what I'm trying to say there? So scholars are saying, well, why did Jesus, why did he do that? Why go all that way up to Sidon to only come back? And there's many different reasons, But I think for me, I think it was probably that he wanted that time to speak to his disciples. He wanted that time. He couldn't get the time when he was there in Tyre, because when he was in Tyre, people would have come to him, like this woman came to him. So he perhaps didn't get that time, and he knew he wasn't going to get that time. So he said, I'll take a detour, I'll take a long road round, and I'll speak to my disciple. Because remember we talked about him being peripatetic. That meant he walked around. That's what it means. He was a peripatetic teacher. So as he walked, he was teaching his disciples. So I think Jesus would have used that time in order to speak to his disciples. Because personally, as we go in, as we'll see in the next couple of weeks, as we go to chapter 8, we see that Peter actually saying, "You are the Christ. You're the Messiah." Remember when he said, who do people say I am? He said, "You're the Messiah. You're the Christ. You're the one that was expected." So we see that there's a transformation in Peter in this next chapter. So I believe that's what was happening. Or it could have been, that he could have just wanted to, that I'll go up through side and I'll come back down the other side. So that it was like taking a big long arch round, because the Decapolis is on the other side of the Jordan. I mean, the Decapolis is like 10 cities. You had 2 on the west bank and you had 8 on the east bank, as it were. So that whole region was a very autonomous region. It was under Roman control, don't get me wrong, but it was allowed a great deal of autonomy. It was allowed to do a lot of things. In fact, it had its own currency. It was that kind of place. They were allowed to raise up armies and things like that as well. So they had a degree of autonomy from Rome. So it was an important place. And what we have to understand is that when Mark is writing this gospel, Mark is writing his gospel because he wants to prove to everybody that Jesus is indeed the Messiah. He is indeed, in fact, the Son of God. And in verse 32, "There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him." I don't know exactly where this place was, but we do know that they brought a man who was deaf and could hardly talk. Now the Greek word for this man's speech difficulty actually means that he had a severe difficulty. This wasn't just a speech impediment, like a lisp or something like this. This was a serious, it was, this guy could hardly talk. He would have difficulty to communicate to people. It wouldn't have been easy for him. And people probably wouldn't have been able to make out what he was trying to say. So you can just imagine how difficult it would be for this man. Not only could he not hear, but he would have great difficulty communicating, getting people to understand him. Now there's a lot of speculation as to the cause of this problem. Some say it must have been that he'd been born deaf, because those born with an inability to hear, unless they receive expert speech therapy, use up mute as well as deaf. And this man, however, was able to speak to a certain degree. So some have speculated that he must have been born deaf, but had lost his hearing at the early age after learning the rudiments of speech. But to be honest, that's all that is speculation. We don't know what it was that caused this man, or when he lost his hearing, or when he lost his speech. But we do know that he was deaf and he could hardly speak at all. And Mark is the only one of the New Testament writers who records this story. Of all the miracles that Jesus performed, Mark alone chooses this one to highlight. There are only 2 instances in the whole of Scripture where this word that is used for speech impediment or speech, is used. The other is in Isaiah, and it's when the prophet is pronouncing on Israel and its neighbours the judgment of God. What God was going to bring on the land. When he was going to make the nation desolate, as it were. And when it says the desert owl and the screech owl will possess it, the great owl and the raven will nest there. God will stretch out Eden, the measuring line of chaos and the plumb line of desolation. Her nobles will have nothing. They're to be called a kingdom. All her princes will vanish away. Thorns will overrun her citadel. Nettles and brambles will be her stronghold. She will become a haunt of jackals, a home for owls. Desert creatures will meet with hyenas and wild goats and bleat to each other. There the night creatures will also lie down and find for themselves places of rest. The owl will nest there and the law and lay eggs. She will hatch them and care for her young under the shadow of her wing. There also the falcons will gather, each with its men. Isaiah was prophesying doom and gloom. He was prophesying divine judgment upon it. But then look what he says next. The desert and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the splendor of our God. Strengthen the feeble hand, steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, the ear of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer. And this is it. The mute tongue shall shout for joy. And that's the exact same word that Mark uses. And it's only used in this one other place. You know, he's talking about death and destruction and desolation, but then he's talking about the change. And what is the change? The change is when the Messiah comes. This is a prophetic word that's talking about the Messiah, and it's talking about Jesus. And that's why Mark probably chose this. I believe that Mark must have had this prophecy in mind when he thought about this man, when he talked about this man's tongue being loosed, that he could speak and speak perfectly. And in verse 33, after he took him aside away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into this man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. You know, like the Syrophoenician woman, this man was in all probability a Gentile. For the area of the Decapolis was predominantly made up of Gentiles. Those who the Jewish leaders called dogs. And if you remember, we talked about this, the scavenger dogs. We're not talking about the household pets here. We're talking about dogs that were wicked and wild, and they would eat human bodies, and that's what they did. These were not nice dogs, you know, that you can go up and pet. These would have bit your hand off. You know, these are wild animals. And that's what the Jews were calling these Gentiles, as it were. And these Gentiles were dogs. They were unclean. You didn't go near them, because even if you so much as brushed against them, you were then made unclean. You couldn't even touch a Gentile. And yet, what did we see Jesus? What's the first thing Jesus did?